London in 1805, a complete portrait of the great city. A comprehensive historical overview. Chapter 1, The Physical City, Streets, Buildings, and Geography. Introduction to the Metropolis. London in 1805 stood as the largest city in the world, a sprawling metropolis that commanded attention, respect, and often fear from those who encountered it for the first time. With a population approaching 1 million inhabitants, it dwarfed every other European capital and represented the beating heart of the most powerful empire the world had yet seen. The city stretched along both banks of the River Thames, though the northern bank contained the vast majority of development and population, from the ancient Tower of London in the east to the fashionable developments of Mayfair in the west. The city covered an area that would take several hours to traverse on foot. The River Thames. The Thames served as London's primary artery, its lifeblood, and its main highway. In 1805, only 3 bridges crossed the river within the city proper: the ancient London Bridge, Westminster Bridge, completed in 1750, and Blackfriars Bridge, finished in 1769. London Bridge remained the oldest, though it had been stripped of its medieval houses decades earlier and presented a somewhat cleaner appearance than in centuries past. The river teemed with activity from dawn until dusk. Thousands of boats, barges, wherries, and ships of every description crowded the waterway. Watermen plied their trade, ferrying passengers across and along the river for fares that varied according to distance and weather conditions. These watermen numbered in the thousands and were known for their colorful language and rough manners. The Pool of London, the stretch of river below London Bridge, presented one of the world's most impressive commercial spectacles. Here, ships from every corner of the globe crowded together so densely that one might almost walk from one bank to the other across their decks. The forest of masts stretched as far as the eye could see, representing trade connections with the Americas, Africa, India, China, and every European port. The streets and their condition. London's streets in 1805 presented a study in contrasts. The main thoroughfares in wealthy areas featured cobblestones and primitive drainage systems, while the narrow alleys and courts of poorer districts often remained unpaved, turning to thick mud during rain and baking into choking dust during dry periods. Street lighting had improved considerably in recent decades. Oil lamps mounted on posts illuminated the major streets, though their light remained dim by modern standards. Lamplighters made their rounds each evening, climbing their ladders to light each lamp individually, and returning in the morning to extinguish them. The wealthy areas of the West End received better lighting than the cramped streets of the East End or the rookeries of Seven Dials. The streets presented constant obstacles to navigation. Street vendors occupied every available corner, hawking their wares with distinctive cries. Pedestrians competed for space with horses, carriages, carts, and sedan chairs. Animal waste accumulated on roadways, and crossing sweepers earned pennies by clearing paths through the filth for well-dressed pedestrians. The Great Divide, East and West. The social geography of London in 1805 followed a clear pattern that would persist for generations. The West End represented wealth, fashion, and political power. Here stood the grand townhouses of the aristocracy, the elegant squares designed by the great architects of the Georgian era, and the shops and establishments that catered to refined tastes. Mayfair had emerged as the most prestigious address in London. Berkeley Square, Grosvenor Square, and Hanover Square contained the residences of dukes, earls, and the wealthiest commoners in the kingdom. These houses featured classical facades, large windows, and interiors decorated with the finest furniture, paintings, and decorative arts that money could purchase. The West End also contained St. James's SS, where gentlemen's clubs proliferated, and the Prince of Wales maintained his residence at Carlton House. Bond Street and Oxford Street provided shopping for the fashionable, while the theatres of Drury Lane and Covent Garden offered entertainment. The East End presented an entirely different world. Here, the docks and warehouses employed thousands of laborers. Shipbuilding, rope-making, and associated maritime trades dominated the economy. The streets were narrower, the housing more crowded, and the population far more diverse. Sailors from every nation walked these streets, and the area developed a reputation for vice, crime, and danger. The City of London. The ancient city of London, the square mile that had formed the original Roman settlement, retained its medieval street pattern, despite the Great Fire of 1666. Narrow lanes wound between tall buildings, and the great commercial institutions dominated the landscape. The Bank of England, completed in its current form by Sir John Soane, represented the financial power of the nation. The Royal Exchange stood nearby, where merchants and traders gathered daily to conduct business. The Guildhall remained the seat of city government, and the ancient livery companies continued to exercise considerable influence. St. Paul's Cathedral, Christopher Wren's masterpiece, completed just over a century earlier, dominated the skyline with its great dome. The cathedral served not only as a place of worship, but as a national monument and gathering place for great occasions of state. Housing and domestic architecture. The Georgian townhouse represented the standard form of urban housing for the middle and upper classes. These homes featured uniform facades, sash windows, and classical proportions that gave entire streets a harmonious appearance. The typical townhouse rose 3 or 4 stories, with servants' quarters in the basement and attic, reception rooms on the ground and first floors, and bedrooms above. The wealthy might occupy an entire house, while those of more modest means often rented floors or rooms within larger buildings. The poorest Londoners crowded into cellars, garrets, and the crumbling tenements of the old rookeries, where entire families might occupy a single room. Chapter 2. The People. Social classes and daily life. The aristocracy and upper classes. At the pinnacle of London's society in 1805 stood the aristocracy, the hereditary nobles who held titles passed down through generations. Dukes, marquises, earls, viscounts, and barons formed an exclusive society with strict rules of precedence and behavior. These families owned vast country estates, but maintained London townhouses for the social season, which ran roughly from February through July. The social season governed the lives of the upper classes. During these months, families opened their London houses, and a constant round of balls, dinners, receptions, and other entertainments occupied nearly every evening. Mornings saw calls paid and received, while afternoons might include rides in Hyde Park or promenades along fashionable streets. Marriage represented the primary business of the season. Families brought daughters to London to find suitable husbands, and the intricate dance of courtship followed strict conventions. Introductions required proper sponsorship, and young women could not appear at certain functions until they had been formally presented at court. The court of King George III, though diminished by the monarch's recurring illness, remained the ultimate arbiter of social acceptance. Presentation at court required elaborate formal dress, including hooped skirts for women that had otherwise gone out of fashion, and the ceremony at St. James's Palace marked a young woman's official entry into society. The gentry and professional classes. Below the aristocracy stood the gentry, families of good birth who might own country estates, but lacked hereditary titles. This group merged imperceptibly with the upper reaches of the professional classes, successful lawyers, physicians, senior clergy, and military officers of high rank. These families lived comfortably in London's better neighborhoods, maintained servants, and participated in social activities appropriate to their station. Their sons attended public schools and universities, entered professions or the military, and sought to maintain or improve the family's position through advantageous marriages and successful careers. The growing commercial wealth of London created a substantial class of prosperous merchants, bankers, and tradesmen who aspired to gentility. These families lived in fine houses, educated their children well, and often sought to purchase country estates that would elevate their social standing. The middle classes. The true middle classes of 1805 included shopkeepers, lesser merchants, clerks, teachers, and minor professionals. These Londoners lived respectably, but without luxury, often occupying floors within larger houses rather than entire buildings. They employed perhaps a single servant, dressed neatly but without ostentation, and worked long hours to maintain their precarious position above the laboring masses. A shopkeeper's day might begin before dawn, preparing goods for sale, and end late in the evening after closing and accounting. The entire family often participated in the business, with wives and older children serving customers or managing accounts. Sundays provided the only regular respite from work. Education for middle-class children varied considerably. Sons might attend day schools or receive education from tutors, preparing them for apprenticeships or clerkships. Daughters learned household management, basic literacy, and the accomplishments considered appropriate for their station. The working classes. The vast majority of London's population belonged to the working classes, a diverse group ranging from skilled craftsmen to casual laborers surviving on irregular employment. This population lived in conditions that shocked observers even in 1805, crowding into inadequate housing and working brutal hours for minimal wages. Skilled workers included the craftsmen who produced the goods that made London wealthy, watchmakers, goldsmiths, furniture makers, printers, and hundreds of other specialized trades. These workers had often completed lengthy apprenticeships and belonged to trade organizations that attempted to maintain standards and wages. A skilled craftsman might earn enough to support his family in modest comfort. Unskilled laborers formed a much larger group. Dock workers, porters, coal heavers, and similar workers performed backbreaking physical labor for wages that barely sustained life. Their employment often proved irregular, dependent on shipping arrivals, weather, and economic conditions. During slack periods, families faced genuine destitution. Women of the working classes participated fully in the economy. They worked in domestic service, sold goods in markets and streets, labored in workshops, and supplemented family incomes however possible. Many combined paid work with the care of children and households, working impossible hours under desperate conditions. The servants. Domestic service employed an enormous proportion of London's population, particularly women. A great aristocratic household might employ dozens of servants, from the butler and housekeeper at the top of the hierarchy to the scullery maids and boot boys at the bottom. Servants lived within their employers' houses, receiving room and board, in addition to wages that varied according to position and household. Their hours were long, their tasks often exhausting, and their personal freedom severely limited. Yet service provided security, regular meals, and housing that many alternatives could not match. The relationship between servants and employers ranged from genuine affection to brutal exploitation. Good employers provided fair treatment, adequate food, and considered their servants' welfare. Others treated servants as barely human, overworking and underpaying them, and dismissing them without reference for minor offenses. The poor and desperate. At the bottom of London's social hierarchy existed a population of desperate poverty that observers estimated in the tens of thousands. These Londoners survived through begging, theft, prostitution, and casual labor, so irregular it barely qualified as employment. The rookeries, the most notorious slums, contained populations living in conditions of unimaginable squalor. Entire families occupied single rooms in crumbling buildings where sanitation was non-existent and disease spread rapidly. Gin, cheap and readily available, provided temporary escape from misery and contributed to further degradation. Crime flourished in these conditions. London possessed no professional police force in 1805, relying instead on the antiquated system of parish constables and night watchmen who could barely maintain order in respectable neighborhoods, let alone penetrate the criminal underworld. Thieves, pickpockets, prostitutes, and their various associates operated with relative impunity in certain areas. Chapter 3: Commerce, Trade, and Economy. London as a commercial capital. London in 1805 functioned as the commercial capital of the world's most extensive trading empire. The East India Company, the Hudson's Bay Company, and numerous other chartered enterprises directed global trade from London offices. Merchants organized ventures to every corner of the known world, and the profits that flowed back transformed the city and the nation. The City of London remained the heart of commercial activity. Here, in counting houses and coffee shops, merchants negotiated deals, arranged shipments, and managed the complex financial instruments that made international trade possible. Bills of exchange, letters of credit, and insurance policies all found their markets in the city's specialized establishments. Lloyd's Coffee House had evolved into the world's leading marine insurance market. Here, underwriters assessed risks and provided the coverage that allowed merchants to venture capital on voyages around the world. The specialized knowledge accumulated at Lloyd's about ships, captains, and trading routes made it indispensable to maritime commerce. The docks and shipping. The inadequacy of London's traditional river wharves had become apparent by 1805, and the great enclosed dock systems that would transform the East End were under construction. The West India Docks, opened in 1802, represented the first of these new facilities, providing secure warehousing for the sugar, rum, and other products of the Caribbean trade. The traditional Pool of London remained crowded with shipping, though increasingly the larger vessels unloaded at the new docks. Smaller coastal vessels continued to use the river wharves, bringing coal from Newcastle, grain from East Anglia, and manufactured goods from provincial ports. The maritime trades employed thousands of Londoners. Shipwrights built and repaired vessels in yards along the river. Rope makers, sailmakers, and chandlers provided necessary supplies. Dockers loaded and unloaded cargo, and watermen transported goods and passengers across the river. Manufacturing and crafts. London in 1805 remained primarily a commercial and financial center rather than an industrial one. The great factories of the Industrial Revolution were rising in the Midlands and the North, where water power and coal supplies made manufacturing more efficient. Yet London contained numerous workshops and manufactories producing goods for local consumption and luxury markets. The skilled trades that had made London famous continued to flourish. Watchmakers in Clerkenwell produced timepieces prized throughout Europe. Furniture makers and workshops scattered across the city created pieces for wealthy households. Goldsmiths and silversmiths worked their crafts in traditional centers. Printing and publishing had centered in London for centuries, and the industry flourished in 1805. Newspapers, books, pamphlets, and prints poured from London presses. Fleet Street had established itself as the center of the newspaper trade, and booksellers clustered in Paternoster Row near St. Paul's Cathedral. Shops and retail trade. London's shops ranged from the magnificent establishments of Bond Street and Oxford Street to the humble stalls of street markets. The wealthy shopped at specialized stores, where proprietors knew their names and extended credit as a matter of course. These shops displayed goods attractively in large windows, a relatively recent innovation that transformed retail trade. The great linen drapers and haberdashers of the West End had developed into something approaching modern department stores. These establishments employed numerous assistants, maintained extensive stocks, and catered to fashionable clientele with the latest goods from manufacturers at home and abroad. Markets remained essential to London's food supply. Smithfield handled livestock brought from across England for slaughter. Billingsgate sold fish in quantities that fed the entire metropolis. Covent Garden provided fruits and vegetables, and specialized markets handled hay, coal, and other necessities. Banking and finance. The Bank of England dominated London's financial landscape in 1805. Established in 1694, it had become the banker to the government, managing the national debt and providing the financial resources that funded the ongoing war against Napoleon. The bank's notes circulated widely, though they would not become legal tender until later in the century. Private banks clustered near the Bank of England and the Royal Exchange. These institutions, often partnerships of wealthy individuals, provided banking services to merchants, landowners, and other clients of substance. They accepted deposits, made loans, and facilitated the complex financial transactions that commerce required. The London Stock Exchange, formally organized only a few years earlier, provided a market for government securities and the shares of the major trading companies. Speculation in these securities had become a significant activity, with fortunes made and lost on price movements. Chapter 4: Culture, Entertainment, and the Arts. The theater. London's theatrical life centered on the two patent theaters, Drury Lane and Covent Garden, which held royal patents, giving them exclusive rights to perform legitimate drama. These enormous houses could seat several thousand spectators, and presented a repertoire that ranged from Shakespeare to contemporary comedies and spectacles. The great actors of the age drew crowds that packed these theaters night after night. Sarah Siddons, though nearing the end of her career, remained the greatest tragic actress of the English stage. John Philip Kemble, her brother, dominated male roles with a formal, classical style that audiences admired. Theater audiences in 1805 behaved nothing like modern audiences. They talked, ate, drank, and moved about throughout performances. The pit, where groundlings stood or sat on benches, could become rowdy, and disputes sometimes escalated into riots. The galleries above held working-class spectators who made their opinions known vocally. Beyond the patent theaters, numerous minor theaters and places of entertainment offered various diversions. Astley's Amphitheater presented equestrian displays and melodramas. Sadler's Wells offered entertainment that skirted the patent theater's monopoly through technicalities. Pleasure gardens provided outdoor entertainment during the summer months. Music and concerts. Musical life in London flourished in 1805. Though opera remained a primarily Italian affair, the King's Theatre in the Haymarket presented Italian opera to fashionable audiences, with performances by the leading singers of Europe. The expense of attending made opera an exclusively upper-class entertainment. Concerts took place in various venues, from the great halls of the nobility to more modest public rooms. The professional concerts and other series presented orchestral and chamber music to subscribers. Taverns and pleasure gardens offered less elevated musical entertainment. Church music remained important, with the cathedrals and major churches maintaining choral establishments. St. Paul's and Westminster Abbey presented services with elaborate musical accompaniments on major occasions. Literature and publishing. London in 1805 stood at the center of the English literary world. Publishers concentrated in the streets around St. Paul SS, and booksellers served an increasingly literate public hungry for reading material of every description. The novel had established itself as a major literary form. Jane Austen had not yet published, but other novelists produced works that found eager audiences. Gothic novels enjoyed particular popularity, and the circulating libraries that had sprung up across London made these books available to readers who could not afford to purchase them. Poetry flourished in the Romantic era that was well underway by 1805. William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge had published their groundbreaking lyrical ballads in 1798, and a new generation of poets was emerging. Robert Southey had established himself, and younger poets, including Lord Byron, were beginning their careers. Newspapers and periodicals informed and entertained London's readers. The Times, the Morning Post, the Morning Chronicle, and numerous other papers provided news, commentary, and entertainment. The Edinburgh Review, founded in 1802, was transforming periodical criticism, and London publications competed for influence. Art and artists. London's art world, in 1805, centered on the Royal Academy, founded in 1768 under royal patronage. The Academy's annual exhibition drew crowds to Somerset House, where paintings competed for attention and sales. Election to the Academy represented the highest recognition available to British artists. The great artists of the period worked in London, seeking patrons and recognition. J.M.W. Turner had established himself as the leading landscape painter, his works commanding high prices and critical acclaim. John Constable was developing the style that would later bring him fame, though recognition came slowly. Portrait painting remained the most lucrative branch of the profession. The wealthy wanted their images preserved for posterity, and successful portraitists earned substantial incomes. Thomas Lawrence had emerged as the leading portraitist, his flattering style appealing to aristocratic clients. Print shops displayed engravings, caricatures, and satirical prints that commented on politics, society, and culture. James Gilray's savage caricatures attracted crowds to shop windows, where the latest prints mocked politicians and public figures with brutal wit. Education and intellectual life. London contained numerous schools serving every level of society. The great public schools, including Westminster, sent boys to Oxford and Cambridge, preparing the sons of the elite for leadership. Grammar schools and private academies educated the middle classes, while charity schools provided basic literacy to the children of the poor. The dissenting academies, founded because non-Anglicans could not attend the universities, often provided more practical and modern education than traditional institutions. These schools taught science, modern languages, and other subjects neglected by classical education. Scientific and intellectual societies flourished in London. The Royal Society, founded in 1660, remained the preeminent scientific organization. The Royal Institution, established in 1799, presented public lectures on scientific subjects that attracted fashionable audiences. Humphrey Davy's chemistry lectures drew crowds to Albemarle Street. Chapter 5: Politics, War, and National Events. The Government of Great Britain. In 1805, Great Britain was governed under the constitutional system that had evolved since the Glorious Revolution of 1688. King George III remained on the throne, though his recurring mental illness had caused crises and would eventually require a formal regency. The monarch retained significant influence, but ruled through ministers responsible to Parliament. William Pitt the Younger served as Prime Minister, a position he had held, with one interruption, since 1783. Pitt had guided Britain through the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, organized coalitions against France, and managed the nation's finances during wartime. His health was failing in 1805, and he would die early the following year. Parliament consisted of the House of Lords, where hereditary peers and bishops sat, and the House of Commons, elected on a restricted franchise that gave votes only to property owners. The electoral system that would later be attacked as corrupt and unrepresentative was simply accepted as the natural order in 1805. London government remained fragmented among numerous authorities. The City of London governed itself through its ancient corporation, with a Lord Mayor, aldermen, and common councillors. Westminster had separate arrangements, and the numerous parishes that made up the rest of London each had their own vestries and officials. The war with France. The dominating fact of political life in 1805 was the ongoing war with Napoleonic France. Britain had been at war, with only a brief interruption, since 1793, and the struggle had shaped every aspect of national life. Napoleon Bonaparte, now Emperor of the French, had assembled an army at Boulogne that threatened invasion of England itself. The threat of invasion hung over Britain throughout the early months of 1805. Napoleon's Grande Armée, perhaps the finest military force in European history, waited across the Channel for the opportunity to cross. British defenses included not only the Royal Navy, but volunteer forces raised across the country, though their effectiveness against Napoleon's veterans remained questionable. The Royal Navy represented Britain's primary defense, and its greatest strategic asset. The fleet maintained a constant blockade of French ports, preventing Napoleon's warships from combining and controlling the Channel long enough to cover an invasion. The strain on ships and crews was enormous, but the blockade held. The Battle of Trafalgar. October 21, 1805, brought the climactic naval battle that would ensure British maritime supremacy for over a century. Vice Admiral Lord Nelson, Britain's greatest naval hero, brought the combined fleet of France and Spain to battle off Cape Trafalgar on the Spanish coast. Nelson's tactical genius produced a crushing victory, breaking through the enemy line in 2 columns. The British fleet destroyed the combined fleet as an effective force. France and Spain lost 22 ships of the line, while Britain lost none. The threat of invasion ended permanently. The victory came at a terrible cost. Nelson himself fell during the battle, shot by a French marksman as he walked the quarterdeck of HMS Victory wearing his decorations. He lived long enough to learn of the victory, dying with the words, "Thank God I have done my duty," on his lips. News of the battle reached London in early November, and the city erupted in celebration even as it mourned its fallen hero. Nelson became an instant legend, his memory enshrined in the national consciousness as the savior of the nation. The great column in what would become Trafalgar Square would later commemorate his victory. Domestic politics. Beyond the war, numerous political issues occupied London's attention in 1805. The condition of Ireland, united with Britain only 5 years earlier, remained troubled. Catholic emancipation, which would grant full civil rights to Catholics, was a controversial issue that had contributed to Pitt's earlier resignation. The slave trade continued to attract opposition from the abolitionist movement that William Wilberforce led in Parliament. Though the trade would not be abolished until 1807, the campaign had gained momentum through the early years of the century. Economic distress, caused partly by wartime disruption of trade and partly by the ongoing transformation of agriculture and manufacturing, produced unrest in various parts of the country. High food prices, particularly for bread, created hardship for the working classes and occasional outbursts of protest. Crime and order. London possessed no professional police force in 1805. Order depended on the ancient system of parish constables, night watchmen, and the occasional intervention of military forces during serious disturbances. The Bow Street Runners, a small group of thief-takers attached to the Bow Street Magistrates' Court, represented the closest approximation to professional law enforcement. Crime flourished in these conditions. Pickpockets worked the crowded streets, and more serious criminals operated with relative impunity in the rookeries and slums. The penalty for many offenses remained death, but the chances of apprehension remained low enough that deterrence failed. The courts dispensed justice according to laws that shocked later sensibilities. Death could be imposed for hundreds of offenses, including thefts of modest value. Transportation to the Australian colonies provided an alternative to execution, though conditions on transport ships and in the colonies themselves remained brutal. Chapter 6: Health, Challenges, and Daily Realities. Disease and Medicine. London in 1805 was not a healthy place to live. The crowded conditions, primitive sanitation, and inadequate water supply created perfect conditions for epidemic disease. Smallpox, typhus, and various fevers swept through the population with regularity, while tuberculosis remained a constant presence. Medical science in 1805 understood little about the causes of disease. The germ theory of disease lay decades in the future, and physicians attributed illness to miasmas, imbalances of humors, and other factors that now seem fanciful. Treatment often did more harm than good, with bleeding, purging, and dosing with mercury among the favored remedies. Edward Jenner's development of smallpox vaccination, published in 1798, represented a genuine advance that was beginning to show results by 1805. Vaccination was spreading, though resistance remained significant, and the terrible scourge of smallpox would eventually be controlled. Hospitals existed to serve the sick poor, though their effectiveness remained limited. The great voluntary hospitals, including St. Thomas Sesses, St. Bartholomew's, and Guy's, provided care that was free at the point of service, but often ineffective given the state of medical knowledge. Wealthier patients received care at home. Childbirth remained dangerous for both mothers and infants. Maternal mortality claimed perhaps 1 in every 100 women who gave birth, while infant mortality ensured that roughly 1/4 of children died before reaching their first birthday. These grim statistics were simply accepted as facts of life. Sanitation and water. London's sanitation systems remained primitive by any modern standard. The majority of houses relied on cesspools, which required periodic emptying by night soil men who carted the waste away for use as agricultural fertilizer. These cesspools often leaked, contaminating wells and groundwater. The water supply came from various sources, none of them safe by modern standards. The Thames itself provided water for many Londoners, pumped by the London Bridge Waterworks, and distributed through wooden pipes. Private water companies supplied other areas, but coverage remained incomplete and quality unreliable. The river served simultaneously as water supply and sewer, receiving the waste of the entire metropolis. The consequences for public health were severe, though the connection between contaminated water and disease would not be understood until later in the century. Food and nutrition. The food supply of London in 1805 required an enormous logistical effort. The city produced almost nothing itself, depending entirely on supplies brought from the countryside and beyond. Cattle were driven through the streets to Smithfield for slaughter. Vegetables came by wagon from market gardens. Fish arrived at Billingsgate from the coast and from the Thames itself. Bread remained the staple food for the majority of the population, and the price of bread determined whether families would eat adequately or go hungry. Wheat prices had risen during the war years, causing genuine hardship for the poor. The Corn Laws, which restricted imports of foreign grain, kept prices high to benefit landowners at the expense of consumers. The wealthy ate well, enjoying a variety of foods that would seem familiar today. Roasted meats, elaborate puddings, vegetables in season, and imported luxuries appeared on aristocratic tables. The middle classes ate more modestly, but adequately. The poor subsisted on bread, potatoes, cheese, and whatever else they could afford. Adulteration of food was common and largely uncontrolled. Bakers added alum to whiten bread, milk was watered, and sometimes colored with chalk. Tea was stretched with various additives. These practices were known and condemned, but continued for want of effective regulation. Transportation and travel. Moving through London in 1805 depended primarily on foot, horse, or water. The wealthy maintained their own carriages, while those of more modest means relied on hackney coaches for hire, or simply walked wherever they needed to go. The streets presented constant challenges to movement. Traffic jams occurred frequently as the narrow medieval streets of the city proved inadequate for the volume of vehicles attempting to pass. The noise of iron-shod hooves and iron-rimmed wheels on cobblestones created a constant din. Public transportation was beginning to emerge. Short stage coaches provided regular services between London and nearby villages, and the first experiments with omnibus-style vehicles were taking place. These services remained limited, and most Londoners continued to walk. Travel beyond London occurred by stagecoach, private carriage, or on horseback. The mail coach service, introduced in 1784, provided the fastest regular travel, with coaches departing from London on fixed schedules and arriving at provincial destinations with remarkable punctuality. A journey that took days by ordinary coach might be accomplished overnight by mail coach. Fire and other hazards. Fire remained a constant threat in a city built largely of wood and heated entirely by open flames. The Great Fire of 1666 remained within living memory as a warning of what could occur. Every parish maintained fire engines and crews, but these primitive machines could do little against a serious conflagration. Insurance companies had developed in response to fire risk. The Sun, the Phoenix, and other companies sold policies and maintained their own fire brigades. Houses displaying a company's fire mark could expect assistance from that company's brigade, though brigades would sometimes assist uninsured properties as well. Other hazards threatened Londoners daily. Building collapses, traffic accidents, and industrial injuries claimed regular victims. The river took its toll in drownings, many of them never investigated. Violence, both criminal and domestic, added to the mortality. Religion and morality. The Church of England remained the established church, and its parishes provided the basic structure of local government as well as religious services. Parish churches held Sunday services that many attended, though the intensity of religious devotion varied considerably. Dissenting Protestant churches served those who rejected the established church's teachings or governance. Methodists, Baptists, Congregationalists, and Quakers all maintained congregations in London, worshipping in their own meeting houses. These groups often emphasized moral reform and provided social support networks for their members. The small but significant Jewish community centered in the East End, maintaining synagogues and community institutions that served a population engaged primarily in commerce. Catholics, still subject to legal disabilities, worshipped more quietly but maintained their own churches and charitable institutions. Moral reform movements had gained strength in the late 18th century. The Society for the Suppression of Vice and similar organizations campaigned against what they perceived as moral decay. Their targets included prostitution, gambling, Sabbath breaking, and the sale of obscene publications. Conclusion: the character of the age. London in 1805 stood at a pivotal moment in history. The old world of aristocratic privilege and traditional social structures still prevailed, but the forces that would transform society were already at work. The Industrial Revolution was gaining momentum, creating new forms of wealth and new social challenges. The war with France would soon end, ushering in a period of both celebration and adjustment. The London of 1805 was simultaneously magnificent and squalid, powerful and vulnerable, confident and anxious. It was a city of extreme contrasts, where wealth beyond imagination existed alongside poverty that shocked observers. It was the capital of an empire that spanned the globe, yet it could not provide clean water or basic sanitation for its own inhabitants. The Londoners of 1805 lived lives that would seem unimaginably difficult by modern standards, yet they built, created, traded, governed, and celebrated in ways that laid the foundations for the modern world. Their city, for all its faults, represented human achievement on a grand scale, and their struggles and triumphs deserve to be remembered. The spirit of the age combined classical elegance with brutal practicality, refined sensibility with raw commercialism, traditional values with revolutionary changes. London in 1805 was a city in transition, poised between the Georgian world that had shaped it and the Victorian world that would transform it. Understanding this moment illuminates not only the past, but the ongoing process of urban development and social change that continues to shape our world.